Hi everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to pick up our topic or conversation with investigating individual constraints of Newell's model in a bit more depth. We've covered them previously just as a concept, but as I think many students or people come across when they're first exploring this idea of Newell's model and an individual constraint, we kind of struggle at trying to figure out how to fully explain all the changes that occur to our structural selves over the course of a lifespan. Of course, there's so much to cover there. We try to cover as much as we can here, hitting kind of like the key points. And hopefully by the end of this lecture or lecture series, there's going to be a few different posts or videos that kind of break this up into components for you. You'll be able to better understand, or at least have a big broad picture of a few main systems as far as our structural physical selves as we change over time. When we go to explore other concepts, and even through this one, when we're exploring individual constraints, we'll talk about environmental constraints, but we'll kind of tie them back into our individual selves. So the functional component or the functional constraint, our cognitive processes, our moods, etc. All those are under functional constraints. We'll cover those and tie them in as we go along. Okay. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we're going to look at the physical growth, development, and aging of our body systems today. And I think one of the most profound times that we can all agree where we have a lot of physiological and physical changes in our life is adolescence and puberty. And that's really a great time to kind of look at the differences that we see between, say, like a chronological age and a physiological age, or how our maturation level will be biologically speaking rather than our chronological age. So for example, someone could be 13 and from a biological, physiological standpoint, they could be prepubescent and not have started adolescence yet. They could be right in the middle of it, So again, our chronological age, the actual number, doesn't really hold true to our physiological selves often. And there's lots of little quizzes out on the web and stuff like that now that'll look at like, what is your biological age? And they'll be like, oh, you have the lungs of a 50-year-old or a 15-year-old or something like that, and it's all relative to different screening mechanisms and stuff based off of your biological health profile. So it's kind of interesting, kind of fun to play around with. The accuracy of those, of course, are a little questionable, but I digress. So as we look at kind of people across the lifespan and different ages and what affects their biological systems, we're kind of reminded of two things we've already covered, this idea of universality and individual variability. So, we all have these kind of like genetic foundations or starting bandwidths that we kind of get to start our lives with, and then we have all these external environmental factors that kind of mold and shape our genetics as well. And just to kind of put it out there as a trend that hopefully you'll notice as we go through the material, in particular the later stuff when we're focusing on our systems, you'll notice that we go from like a genetic, more kind of driven life to one that our external world and influences tend to influence us to a greater degree. And so again, a lot of what we cover today and throughout the next few lectures will be speaking generally and universally, on average, typically, like all these terms when we're discussing concepts. But of course, we have individual differences, and we're going to use that to highlight oftentimes how we can kind of mitigate some of the aging processes. Okay. So to tie into our individual constraints or our Newell's model here, we'll see our structural focus today, our biological kind of side of things. It'll probably feel a lot like a physiology class, I think, at times. But of course, our physiology affects our functional stuff, such as our cognitive processes, our motivation, our moods, etc. Right? Okay. So let's take a look at what we'll cover. We're going to kind of start with our prenatal time frame and see what things look like prenatally as we develop. Then we'll get into our postnatal growth, maturation, and aging. And to do that, we're going to more or less break down each of these systems, our nervous, endocrine, skeletal, and muscular. But we're going to start off with kind of like a broad overview of how we grow and develop physiologically before we get into the prenatal stuff. Or sorry, before we get into the aging and the kind of overall process for each of these. And we'll break down each of these systems into kind of like childhood, adolescence, adulthood, older adulthood. Okay, so we'll start off with our prenatal growth. And as you'll note here, we're going to start with our embryonic development, that's 0 to 8 weeks. And then we'll talk about fetal development, which is 8 weeks till birth, which is, again, maybe 37 to 42 kind of weeks, but we'll get into that. Okay. Now, both genetic and extrinsic factors influence normal and abnormal prenatal growth. Again, prenatal, just to kind of give you context, just means before you're born. And again, I kind of set the context where genetics play a larger component before we get into external factors, but we're going to see how extrinsic or outside of the fetus and mother can kind of affect growth and development. So our first 0 to 8 weeks, again, this is embryonic development, and of course, to get everything going, we need to explore or review some of these ideas as far as like our sex cells and how the kind of initial process of life begins. So what happens is we have an ovum or an egg and spermatozoon or sperm for the men. And usually what's typical turnover rate for these cells to be produced in women or females, we have 28 days kind of turnover for one egg, and we'll look at that process a bit closer. And then for men or males, we have 60 to 70 days kind of turnover process of a new sperm. The numbers are like quite large, right? Relatively, we're talking millions rather than single or hundreds, right? So yeah, and once we have these two sex cells come together, what we have is fertilization or fusion when the sperm enters the egg. And yeah, so we get an increased cell division at that point in time. And usually, the best way to kind of think of cells at that time is just kind of blank template cells that are like stem cells or pluripotent, which is like just able to kind of produce and multiply with no specialization by any means on any of those cells. And then in about 7 days after you get fertilization, I'll be in the fallopian tubes, we'll kind of look at that. You get implantation, which is in the uterine wall of the uterus. And that happens about seven days after fertilization. And then differentiation. This is when our cells start dividing to the point in time where we actually have specialized roles for each of our cells that occur. We're going to look at that. That happens a little bit farther down the line. And yeah, we'll look at that. But first, we're going to kind of, I don't want to say like step back from this process. We kind of got the things moving a little quick here, but to kind of take a look at how we actually, obviously really important as far as producing an egg each month. And yeah, I think it's just important to kind of take a look at. So first off, let's start by looking at, let's look at this chart over here on the right, and then we'll kind of get into things. Let's see if I can pull it up. Okay, good. Chart over here on the right. So when we look at our ovarian cycle, or the oocyte, or the egg, if you will, we kind of have this follicle with the egg in it. We hit a point of ovulation where the egg is released. And within this kind of period here, we'll look at the timeline in a bit here. We're most fertile, or women are most fertile, and then you get kind of like disposal of the cell body of the follicle as you go through the rest of menstruation. Okay. What kicks it all off is kind of this like cycle or interchange between different hormones. So typically we'll start off after menstruation, so 0 to 7 days. Well, you can start at the 7-day point, where we'll see an increase of estrogen spike up and an increase in what's called luteinizing hormone and even FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. And all of these lead up to the point where, again, it's kind of like slightly before day 14 and kind of during in and around that time where we have ovulation. Women are most fertile at that point in time, as far as like having implantation occur and fertilization of the egg. And so that's kind of our typical occurrence leading up to fertilization. And again, just to put that in a timeline, this whole phase kind of happens between 0 and 14 days when we see this increase in these 3 hormones within the body. Now, 2 of them come from the pituitary, so that's part of your brain, and estrogen comes from the ovaries, which is the female gonads, essentially. So what else is kind of interesting about this? Around this time, you'll note that body temperature comes up, and I think that's really, really key to, and kind of this one-liner reasoning or thought that comes out as to why human females have the menstrual cycle like this, because not all animals do. In fact, there's relatively few that have a cycle, and definitely most the other mammals that do have this cycle tend not to have it as frequently. So humans have the fastest reproductive cycle in women for this. So the idea is, and I'll try to just cut to the chase here, is as the uterine lining here, which is the inside of the uterus, starts increasing with kind of its, let's say, supply of blood flow and kind of getting a very fertile kind of lining. What will happen during that point in time is a very metabolically demanding. So during this time, we see like a big spike in kind of body temperature as typically, as we kind of increase in, or women increase with their uterine lining. So it's kind of one thing. And then we see the shedding. So after we see this big spike in estrogen and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which cause the release of the egg, one of 2 things occur, and I'll show you if implantation and fertilization occurs. If it doesn't, what will happen is we see this big spike in progesterone, and we'll see shedding of the uterine wall by the time we get to 28 days, and that carries on for this period here where it says menses, so the menstrual cycle. Yeah, so I guess you can kind of break it down into 2 main cycles, really, the follicular and the luteal phase. We have menses, or a period, and you probably could highlight, maybe a little bit somewhere along here, just to about this point where we could have the most fertile point, or you might say like fertile ovulation kind of period there. Okay. I kind of mentioned one of the reasons as far as why women tend to shed their uterine wall is kind of it's very metabolically demanding, and most biological systems do not like to do that. So that's one reasoning or thought as to why that happens. Another is this is a very, again, the prime growing kind of condition or area. So another thought with this is that in order to prevent infection and or disease from occurring, you'll shed this lining and just kind of get a fresh start every month, so to speak. So yes, one thing that's kind of interesting and kind of just to cover the Miller et al. Study, it's kind of interesting. Again, it's this intersection of evolutionary psychology, biology, and psychology, economics, a few things like that. And so anyways, what the study did is it followed 18 exotic dancers for kind of the duration of their monthly cycle, and then broke up their menstrual cycle into 3 different phases, and then essentially just averaged out how much they made in tips for each part of their cycle. And now obviously there's a lot of shortcomings to this study. It's self-reported. It's a small sample size. There's only 18 dancers. And yeah, but essentially what they found was during ovulation, women dancers tended to get more tips, like something like $330 on average, whereas when they were in their luteal phase, they tended to be a bit less, more like 250 or something like that, and then during menstruation they were like 150 or something like that. Again, the numbers might not be exact. But yeah, so the idea and the conclusion of this study was like, oh, like there's some, biological unconscious kind of level of attractiveness that is increased during ovulation and stuff like that. But, they also said, okay, maybe it's not, something biologically that changes that makes women more attractive to men. Again, this is like heterosexual kind of attraction, but maybe there's also this other component where women tend to be change their behavior as well around that time, where maybe a bit more flirtatious or smiling or something like that. So yeah, there's kind of this idea where there's like potentially a biological, psychological kind of component that occurs around that time. But it's kind of just interesting for discussion, no less, for sure. Yeah, so we're going from our sex cells, which get produced every month for when we're talking about women. And once they're produced, we kind of go through this process where, again, the term fertilization occurs within the fallopian tube. So again, sperm meets egg. It continues to travel along and divide until we get out to this point where we're at the endometrium of the uterus, which is here. This was the ovary over here that produces the eggs or the ovums. But once we get to this point here, we form something called a blastocyte. Okay, and there's like a little embryoblast and trophoblast here. That's just kind of landmarking so that you can location mark on the next couple of slides too. But more or less, once we get to this point in time, we can start getting embryonic development. I don't want to get too far ahead, but there's some key points that kind of happen within this process between those two. Okay, so once we get to the point where, let's say we have implantation on the uterine wall, it's right here, we kind of get these messages and signals going back to our brain to kind of change the way our women's hormones are kind of produced. So we essentially start increasing progesterone and estrone up to kind of like a peak point where we have or women give birth. And this is, again, also not to that degree, but a similar effect when women are using hormonal birth controls. Essentially, these high levels of progesterone and estrone can kind of keep away our follicular phase in humans. So but once we get implantation, then we can get on to what we call differentiation. And that's a really key point when we have our blastula and then into our late gastrula. That's kind of this phase here. And really it's marked by this invagination or folding of cells in the cell to kind of create these extra layers. And those three layers are mesoderm, endoderm, and ectoderm. And those are really important terms to remember because, as we'll come to find, each of those three layers go on to form all the different cells of our body. And really it's the first key point in time where we start seeing differentiation of these cells. So again, differentiation is specializing of certain cells. So here we have our ectoderm, which tends to go into our skin, nerves, and eyes. So ectoderm is kind of this outer layer. Our mesoderm is our muscles, bones, blood kind of in there. And then our endoderm, lungs, linings of gut, and liver. So the way that I tend to remember these things is our ectoderm. I start with my nervous system. And nerves are kind of like an extension of my sensory system too, so like my eyes and touch, so skin, so I kind of remember it that way. Mesoderm, M for muscle, so I just kind of think, okay, my muscles help move my bones, which is my skeletal system, and they're kind of red like blood. And then last but not least, my endoderm is everything inside. Endo means in. So to me, that's like my guts, my lungs, that sort of thing. That's how I tend to remember that. Yeah, and once we get that, we get farther differentiation. Again, so we're going kind of from this 3 germ layer kind of gastrula into more and more foldings and more cells, to the point where now we can start having formation of something really, really important. Again, this is about weeks 2 or 3 after fertilization. And we have implantation. This would be the endometrial wall there. So at weeks 3 to 4, we have this formation of this kind of tissues that we'd see here. And I think a really important thing to highlight at this point in time is something called a notochord. So as we go again from our 3 germ layers into this kind of formation of what's called a neural crest or a neural tube, our notochord is something that we actually share with all vertebrae. So whether you're talking about a turtle, which is a vertebrae, or fish, or whatever, in our developmental stages, lizards, like everything that has a vertebrae, all comes at some point in time in embryonic development to this formation of a notochord. So kind of a shared developmental thing there. After that point, we continue to get some more vaginations, outcroppings. There's certain genes like box genes and stuff that kind of like produce limbs and stuff like that. So we start seeing kind of that. And again, when I have notes here, you can pause and kind of take a look. I should note that really the main thing here is just kind of seeing generally how our growth and development kind of occurs here. Nothing too specific to memorize per se. And so when for example, I'm saying things like cerebellum formation, I'm really not talking about like the cerebellum is fully formed. It just means like there's the beginnings of each of these things. For example, movement begins. Well, it's not movement per se as far as like what we might think of like as a motor skill, but because some synapses are just starting to randomly fire and stuff like that just to depolarize, we do see some movement at that point in time. By the time we get to about 6 to 7 weeks, I think it's really cool because again, this is like at the start of 6 and then 7 weeks, you start seeing the actual formation of fingers, or hand raised as it's called at that point in time, which is pretty cool. And then by the time you get to about 8 weeks, our embryo starts looking like this. And again, we can see that bit of the heart rate is there, very high. On average 170. I mean, if we can think about ourselves when we exercise, that's usually like a max heart rate for many as we get into adulthood. Whereas again, that's just an average heartbeat at that point in time. Yeah. Okay, so again, at this point in time, we start getting into fetal development, and that will be up next.